What happens when you are born into one of the most famous families in modern history, yet spend your entire life trying to escape its shadow? Anthony and Tina. Radziwill had everything: wealth, privilege, royalty, and the Kennedy name. But behind the glamour lay a story of devastating loss, quiet resilience, and lives forever shaped by tragedy. This is the untold chapter history almost forgot. Once the sister living in the shadow of a legend. To understand Anthony and Tina Radziwill, we first have to understand the woman who shaped their world, a woman who spent her entire life standing remarkably close to greatness, yet somehow always just outside its spotlight. Long before she became a princess, long before she became a fashion icon, long before history remembered her as Jackie Kennedy's younger sister, Lee Bouvier was simply a young girl growing up in a world of extraordinary privilege and quiet instability. From the outside, the Bouvier family seemed to embody the American dream at its most glamorous. There were grand homes, elite schools, summers in the Hamptons, and a social status that opened virtually every door. It was the kind of life most people only glimpsed in magazines. But behind the polished photographs, cracks were already beginning to form. Their father, John Bouvier, was charming, sophisticated, and endlessly charismatic. Yet beneath that charm was a recklessness that slowly eroded the foundation of the family. As Lee and her older sister Jackie grew up, they watched their parents' marriage unravel, learning an early lesson that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Appearances can be deceiving. For Lee, that lesson would become deeply personal. Because while Jackie seemed destined for history, Lee spent much of her life searching for something more elusive, an identity that belonged entirely to her. Then everything changed. In 1959, Lee married Prince Stanislaw Radziwill, a Polish aristocrat, whose title instantly transformed her public image. Overnight newspapers embraced the fairy tale narrative. America suddenly had another princess. The photographs were dazzling. The headlines were glamorous. The future appeared limitless. But fairy tales rarely reveal what happens after the wedding. And within months, Lee would become a mother. Soon, 2 children, Anthony and Tina Radziwill, would enter a world filled with privilege, power, and prestige. Yet hidden beneath that extraordinary inheritance was something far heavier: the burden of expectations, the weight of history, and a legacy of loss that neither of them could possibly understand. Their story was about to begin. 2 Children of Camelot. Anthony Radziwill arrived on August 4, 1959. His sister Tina followed just over a year later. From the moment they entered the world, their lives were woven into a story far larger than themselves. Most children inherit a family name. Anthony and Tina inherited history. Their mother was now Princess Lee Radziwill. Their aunt was Jacqueline Kennedy. Their uncle would soon become President of the United States. Even their godfather was John F. Kennedy himself. Before they were old enough to understand power, they were already surrounded by it. Their childhood unfolded between 2 extraordinary worlds. On one side stood the fading elegance of European aristocracy through their father's Polish heritage. On the other stood the rising political dynasty of the Kennedy family, a name that by the early 1960s had become synonymous with hope, glamour, and American ambition. Photographs from those years almost look unreal. The children appear standing outside Buckingham Palace, playing alongside Caroline Kennedy and young John Jr., walking through grand estates and historic corridors as if such places were ordinary playgrounds. But what appears magical in hindsight often feels normal to the people living it. To Anthony and Tina, presidents, diplomats, royalty, and celebrities were simply part of the background of everyday life, yet history was moving toward them faster than anyone realized. In November 1963, the illusion shattered. President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. Anthony was only 4 years old. Tina was 3. They were too young to fully understand what had happened. But children have a way of sensing grief long before they can explain it. Suddenly, the adults around them were different. The laughter was quieter. The smiles seemed forced. An invisible weight had settled over the family. It would not be the last tragedy they witnessed. In many ways, the Kennedy assassination became the first shadow cast across their lives, a reminder that privilege could not protect anyone from loss. And as the years passed, that shadow would only grow longer. 3. A family begins to fracture. For a while, it seemed as though Anthony and Tina had escaped the curse that so often follows famous families. They were growing up surrounded by privilege, protected by wealth, and embraced by one of the most influential dynasties in modern history. From the outside, their future appeared almost guaranteed. But families rarely fall apart all at once. More often, they unravel quietly. By the early 1970s, the marriage between Lee Radziwill and Prince Stanislaw Radziwill had begun to crack beneath the weight of time, ambition, and distance. The glamorous image the world had celebrated for more than a decade was no longer the reality being lived behind closed doors. Then in 1974, it officially ended. Anthony was 14. Tina was 13. At an age when most children are still trying to understand themselves, they were suddenly forced to navigate a divided family. The fairy tale was over. Yet an even deeper loss was waiting just beyond the horizon. Only 2 years later, in July 1976, their father died. Prince Stanislaw Radziwill was gone at just 62 years old. For Anthony and Tina, the loss was profound. Their father had been more than a prince. He was the bridge connecting two worlds, the old European aristocracy and the new American dynasty they called family. And suddenly, that bridge disappeared. Loss had entered their lives once again. But something else was beginning to emerge. As the shadows around them grew longer, both children started moving in different directions, away from the expectations attached to their famous surname, away from the mythology surrounding the Kennedys. Anthony became increasingly focused, ambitious, determined to build something of his own. Tina grew quieter, more private, more difficult to define. Neither of them realized it yet, but the choices they were making during these years would shape the rest of their lives. One would spend his future chasing stories. The other would spend hers avoiding them. And in that contrast, the true story of the Radziwill children was only beginning to reveal itself. 4. The man who refused to live on borrowed glory. As the years passed, Anthony Radziwill began moving in a direction few people expected. Children born into powerful families often spend their lives benefiting from inherited influence. Some embrace it. Others become trapped by it. Anthony seemed determined to do neither. Instead, he chose something far less glamorous. He chose to work. By the time he arrived at Boston University to study broadcast journalism, America was already fascinated by the Kennedy family. Doors would have opened for him almost anywhere. Yet those who knew Anthony often remarked on the same thing: he never behaved as though he were entitled to anything. He wanted to earn his place. After graduation, he entered the demanding world of television production, starting at NBC Sports, before eventually joining ABC News. It was a world measured not by family pedigree, but by performance. Deadlines were ruthless. Mistakes were public. Success had to be earned every single day, and Anthony flourished. While many members of famous families gravitated toward celebrity, Anthony was drawn toward journalism. He preferred asking questions rather than answering them. He preferred shaping stories rather than becoming one. Soon his work began attracting attention. Emmy-winning projects, a prestigious Peabody Award, investigative reporting on some of America's most important and unsettling issues. By the early 1990s, he had built something increasingly rare in the Kennedy orbit, a reputation entirely his own. For perhaps the first time in his life, Anthony was no longer being introduced as someone's nephew, someone's cousin, or someone's son. He was simply Anthony Radziwill, a respected producer, a gifted storyteller, a man creating a future on his own terms. But life has a cruel habit of testing people just when they finally begin to find themselves. And while Anthony was building a career, falling in love, and imagining the decades ahead, something unseen was already waiting in the shadows. Something that cared nothing about success, privilege, or famous names. Something that would soon force him into the greatest battle of his life. 5. The diagnosis that changed everything. Just when it seemed that Anthony Radziwill had finally escaped the gravitational pull of his family's history, life delivered a challenge far more ruthless than public expectations. It arrived quietly, without headlines, without warning. Around the late 1980s, while building his career at ABC News and falling in love with television producer Carol DeFalco, Anthony received devastating news. He had been diagnosed with testicular cancer. At first, it appeared to be a battle he could win. Treatment was aggressive. The disease went into remission. Friends and colleagues believed the crisis had passed. Anthony returned to work focused on the future, determined not to let illness define him. For a while it worked. Then fate intervened again. In early 1994, doctors discovered another tumor. Further testing revealed something far more terrifying, a rare and aggressive soft tissue cancer known as fibrosarcoma. The prognosis was grim. The statistics offered little hope. Anthony was only 34 years old. Most people facing such news would put their lives on hold. Anthony did the opposite. That same year, he married Carol. To those attending the wedding, it looked like the beginning of a beautiful new chapter. Family gathered. Friends celebrated. His cousin John F. Kennedy Jr. stood beside him as best man. But beneath the smiles existed a painful truth known only to a few. Anthony wasn't planning a future anymore. He was fighting for one. And yet, remarkably, he refused to become consumed by fear. He rarely spoke about his illness. He refused to make cancer the center of his identity. Instead, he kept working, kept loving, kept living, as though determination alone could hold back the darkness slowly advancing toward him. But some battles are fought not to win, but to preserve who you are while losing. And Anthony was about to show everyone what that kind of courage truly looks like. 6. The brother he chose. As Anthony's illness progressed, the circle around him grew smaller. Not because people stopped loving him. Because watching someone you love slowly disappear is one of the hardest things a human being can endure. Among those struggling most was one person who had known Anthony almost his entire life, John F. Kennedy Jr. To the public, they were cousins. To those who knew them, they were something closer to brothers. They had grown up together in the strange world that only members of the Kennedy family could truly understand. They shared childhood memories, family tragedies, impossible expectations, and the burden of carrying names that often entered a room before they did. As adults, their bond only deepened. They spoke constantly, sometimes every day. And when Anthony became sick, John was devastated. Yet there was something heartbreaking about the way he responded. Like many people confronted with the possible loss of someone they cannot imagine living without, John struggled to face the reality of what was happening. He held on to hope, perhaps too tightly. Perhaps because accepting the truth would mean accepting that time was running out. Meanwhile, Anthony continued fighting. Surgery after surgery, treatment after treatment, months turning into years. Yet he rarely spoke about death. Instead, he focused on ordinary moments, conversations, work, friendships, family dinners, small pieces of life that suddenly carried enormous meaning. It was as though he understood something many people spend their entire lives missing: that life is not measured by how long it lasts, but by how fully it is lived. By the summer of 1999, however, the truth could no longer be avoided. Anthony was entering the final stage of his battle. The future was shrinking. The people closest to him knew it. And yet none of them could have imagined that another tragedy, one so shocking it would dominate headlines around the world, was only weeks away. A tragedy that would forever link the final days of Anthony Radziwill's life to one of the most devastating moments in Kennedy family history. 7. The summer that took everything. By the summer of 1999, Anthony Radziwill knew something most people spend their lives trying to ignore. Time was running out. Years of surgeries, chemotherapy, and radiation had taken their toll. The cancer was winning. Yet Anthony remained determined to hold on to life for as long as life would have him. That summer, he and Carol spent time on Martha's Vineyard, surrounded by family, friends, and familiar faces. Anthony spoke about sunsets, dinners, and simple moments. He wasn't planning for death. I was still planning for tomorrow. Then came the night of July 16th. A phone call. A routine conversation. Nothing about it suggested history was about to change. At a small airport in New Jersey, John F. Kennedy Jr., his wife Carolyn Bessette, Kennedy and Carolyn's sister Lauren, prepared to board a private plane bound for Martha's Vineyard. They never arrived. Somewhere over the dark Atlantic waters, the aircraft disappeared. At first there was confusion, then concern, then dread. Hour by hour, hope began to evaporate. For the Kennedy family, it felt horrifyingly familiar. Another young life. Another sudden loss. Another chapter of grief added to a story already overflowing with it. When the wreckage was finally discovered beneath the ocean, the truth became unavoidable. John was gone. Carolyn was gone. Lauren was gone. The news stunned the world. But inside the Radziwill family, the tragedy landed with an even deeper cruelty. Anthony was dying. And now the cousin who had stood beside him through his darkest years, the man he loved like a brother, was gone too. For Lee Radziwill, the pain was almost unimaginable. She had already buried her sister Jackie. Now she was watching her son slip away while mourning her nephew at the very same time. It was as if fate had decided that one tragedy was not enough. And heartbreakingly, the worst was still to come. Less than a month after John Kennedy Jr.'s death, Anthony Radziwill's own journey would reach its final chapter. 40 years was all he got. There are moments in some families when grief arrives so relentlessly that it begins to feel less like a series of events and more like a permanent resident. For the Radziwills and the Kennedys, August 1999 became one of those moments. Only weeks after attending memorial services for John F. Kennedy Jr., Anthony Radziwill was nearing the end of his own battle. The disease that had followed him for years had taken almost everything a person can lose: his strength, his certainty, his future. But it never took his dignity. On August 10th, Anthony Radziwill died at the age of 40, an age when most people are planning the next chapter of their lives. Anthony never got that chapter. The timing felt almost unbearably cruel. Less than a month earlier, he had mourned the loss of the cousin he loved like a brother. Now the family was gathering once again, this time to say goodbye to him. Those who knew Anthony rarely spoke first about his illness. They spoke about his character, his kindness, his intelligence, his refusal to let suffering become his identity. Even during the darkest years, he continued to work, continued to love, continued to show up for the people around him. There was a quiet courage in that. Not the dramatic kind celebrated in movies, but the far more difficult kind practiced every day. At his funeral, family members remembered a man who had built a life of substance rather than spectacle. A journalist, a producer, a husband, a friend. Not a prince, not a Kennedy relative. Simply Anthony. And perhaps that was his greatest achievement. In a family consumed by history, he had managed to become entirely himself. Yet as heartbreaking as Anthony's death was, another story was unfolding quietly in the background. The story of the sister who remained. The one who had witnessed every loss. The one who never sought attention. The one who would carry the family's memories long after the headlines disappeared. Tina Radziwill's story was only beginning. 9. The sister who chose silence. After Anthony's death, the spotlight that had briefly turned toward the Radziwill family slowly faded. The headlines moved on, the cameras moved on, the world moved on. But grief rarely does. For Tina Radziwill, the summer of 1999 marked the end of an era. Within weeks, she had lost her brother and watched the Kennedy family endure yet another devastating tragedy. The people who had shaped her world since childhood were disappearing one by one. And yet, unlike so many public figures of her generation, Tina never turned her pain into a public story. She never wrote a memoir, never sat down for revealing television interviews, never tried to reclaim the narrative. Instead, she did something increasingly rare in modern America. She chose privacy. It was a choice that seemed to define her entire life. Even as a child, Tina had existed slightly outside the spotlight. While history focused on presidents, first ladies, and famous relatives, she remained quietly at the edge of the frame, observing rather than performing, listening rather than speaking. As an adult, that instinct only deepened. She worked in film and television, much like her brother, but largely behind the scenes. She married, later divorced, and continued building a life away from public fascination. There were no scandals, no attention-seeking reinventions, no attempts to capitalize on her famous name. In a family where nearly every life eventually became public property, Tina remained an exception. And perhaps that was its own form of strength. Because sometimes survival is not about making the loudest statement. Sometimes it is about refusing to let tragedy become your identity. The world knew the Kennedys. It knew Jackie. It knew John Jr. It even came to know Anthony. But Tina remained something far rarer. A person who chose her own boundaries and kept them. And as the years passed, one person would come to depend on that quiet strength more than anyone else. Her mother, Lee. because after all the loss, only the two of them remained. 10. The last keeper of the family's memories. As the new century began, Lee Radziwill found herself standing in a place she could never have imagined. For decades, she had lived among some of the most recognizable people of the 20th century. Presidents, royalty artists, socialites, and cultural icons had drifted through her life like characters passing through an endless film. Now many of them were gone. Jackie was gone. John Jr. was gone. Anthony was gone. What remained was memory. And Tina. There is something profoundly lonely about outliving the people who helped define your life. The world still saw Lee as glamorous. She continued attending fashion shows, cultural events, and elegant dinners in New York and Paris. Photographs captured the same impeccable style that had made her famous decades earlier. But photographs rarely capture absence. Behind the elegance was a woman carrying the weight of accumulated loss. Perhaps that is why the bond between Lee and Tina seemed to deepen during these years. Mother and daughter had survived the same storms. They had stood together at funerals, shared grief too complicated for public conversation, endured the strange silence that follows unimaginable loss. And unlike many families touched by tragedy, they did not speak about it publicly. They simply carried it. Meanwhile, Tina continued living much as she always had, quietly, deliberately, and far from the spotlight. In an era increasingly obsessed with celebrity, her refusal to become one felt almost radical. Together, they represented something unusual within the Kennedy orbit. Survivors. Not the loudest voices, not the most famous names, simply the ones who remained. Yet even as Lee entered her 80s, one final decision still lay ahead, a decision that would reveal more about her deepest loyalties than perhaps anything she had done during her lifetime. And when that moment came, there would be no ambiguity about who she believed should carry the family's legacy forward. The inheritance of silence. By the time Lee Radziwill reached the final chapter of her life, the world had largely settled on a version of her story. She was the glamorous sister, the princess, the socialite, the woman who spent decades orbiting history without ever quite becoming its center. But the truth was more complicated than that. Because when everything else had been stripped away, the parties, the titles, the famous names, what mattered most to Lee was no longer status. It was family. In February 2019, Lee Radziwill died at the age of 85 in her Manhattan apartment. News reports celebrated her elegance, her friendships with cultural icons, and her extraordinary place in 20th century society. Yet one detail captured particular attention: her will. For years, speculation had surrounded the relationships inside the extended Kennedy and Bouvier families. The public often assumes that famous dynasties operate like kingdoms with fortunes divided among countless heirs and relatives. Lee had other ideas. When the details became public, it was revealed that her estate, estimated at roughly $50 million, had been left entirely to one person: Tina. Not distant relatives, not famous family members, not even those who carried greater public recognition. Everything went to her daughter. The decision surprised some observers, but perhaps it shouldn't have. After all, Tina had been the one who remained. The one who stayed close through the years of loss. The one who never sought attention, never exploited the family name, never turned private grief into public currency. In many ways, the inheritance felt less like a financial decision and more like a final statement. A declaration of trust. A mother's last acknowledgement of the child who had quietly carried the weight of the family's history alongside her. And with that decision, an extraordinary chapter of the Bouvier and Radziwill story narrowed to a single living heir. One daughter. One survivor. One final keeper of memories stretching back to Camelot itself. But perhaps the most remarkable part of this story was not what Tina inherited. It was what she chose to do with it. Almost nothing at all. 12. What remains? And so the story narrows, not with a dramatic ending, not with a final scandal, not with another headline, but with silence. By the 2020s, most of the people who once defined this remarkable family had become figures of history. John F. Kennedy existed in documentaries and archives. Jackie Kennedy remained frozen in America's collective memory. John Jr. had become a symbol of a future that never arrived. Anthony lived on through the stories told by those who loved him. And Tina remained. The last direct link to a branch of the family that once seemed destined to stretch endlessly into the future. There is something deeply ironic about that. The child who spent her life avoiding attention became the final guardian of one of America's most famous family legacies. Yet even then, Tina refused the role history seemed eager to hand her. No memoir, no public reckoning, no attempt to step into the spotlight left vacant by those who came before her. Instead, she continued doing what she had always done, living quietly, deliberately, on her own terms. Perhaps that is what makes the Radziwill story so compelling. At first glance, it appears to be a story about privilege, aristocracy, and proximity to power, the ingredients of a classic American dynasty. But look closer and something else emerges. A story about identity, about loss, about the burden of living inside a famous name while trying to discover who you are without it. Anthony answered that challenge by building a life defined by purpose rather than pedigree. Tina answered it by protecting a private life in a world that increasingly rewards exposure. Both in their own way refused to become characters in a script written by someone else. And perhaps that was their greatest act of courage. Because history often tells us who we are supposed to be, very few people ever find the strength to answer back. The Radziwill children did, and that may be the most extraordinary part of their story. 13. The last of the line. In the years after Lee Radziwill's death, Tina remained the sole heir to a family story that had once captivated the world. She never sought attention, never wrote a memoir, and never stepped into the spotlight left behind by her famous relatives. With no children of her own, Tina became the final direct descendant of Lee and Prince Stanislaw Radziwill. When her chapter eventually closes, so too will this remarkable branch of a family shaped by privilege, tragedy, and history. Yet perhaps that is the most fitting ending of all. Anthony chose purpose over fame. Tina chose privacy over recognition. Both rejected the roles history had written for them. In a family where nearly every life became public property, they spent their lives pursuing something far rarer, the freedom to be themselves.